I remember that for a long time, I didn't notice that it never went to dawn to daylight again.
Right.
Because, because it like went, it was so long, like because you're it's daylight, and then it goes dusk and then night and then dusk night.
Yeah.
And so we've been going for like 3 days or so. And we hadn't seen daylight again, right?
Yeah.
And so it was like, is that what the daylight looks
Always
like?
looked like?
Always
Yeah.
looked like?
Yeah.
I don't even remember anymore. And then somebody crashed, and it was like, oh wow, it's so bright now.
Yeah.
One color difference.
But yeah, maybe. And actually, the fun thing, you can't see this on the screen, but around the outside of the Desert Bus game, there's this green border. Which is normally would be cut off on like a CRT television, but because we're
Not doing overscan.
playing it on a regular LCD, you can see it, and we're cropping it out of the bus cam because you don't normally want to see it. But the fun thing is you can see that they're just doing a palette swap on the on the track because the outside border, the green from the outside border, just changes as well when you change to a different when it changes from day till dusk till night.
It's like a filter, basically.
Well, I think it's supposed to be like the base color. That they might lay that down because it's funny because the green they use is not the same as the green that's on the pine tree.
Mm.
Right.
And
I guess so, yeah.
And this kind of this mustard is not the same color as the lines in the middle. So it's like. So is it a modifier that's meant like by changing the hue on the outside? Is that actually then is it acting as like, oh, this is like the color you use to transform the environment? And if that's the case, then what's this going to look like? Because I think is this our first year playing it on a non-overscan?
No, we played it on LCD for a number of years.
So what's the color around the frame look like when it's dark out? Does it just go fully black?
I guess we'll find out. I mean, Ian would have seen it earlier today, but presumably
like
we'll find out as long as nobody crashes.
Maybe it is like it takes a pull from that as like a multiply or something. I don't know. I'm gonna just stop talking about it.
There's speaking of that's I just recently got like super into watching a bunch. There's a great series of YouTube videos by a guy who worked on a bunch of games for the Sega Genesis.
Oh yeah.
That used like I think it was like Mickey's Magical something, Mickey's Magical Quest and like Sonic Dash and like a few of these games for the original Sega Genesis that did some really crazy things that people were like, how did you do that? And he did a whole YouTube. There's a YouTube series where he's showing basically like how they did all these crazy effects with the very, very limited amount of memory and colors and everything that a Sega Genesis could do. Like they had there's a Toy Story game for Sega Genesis because when Toy Story came out, they made a game for it. They made a tie-in game, and it actually has like a 3D Doom or like Wolfenstein style area where you like go around in 3D in like a first person thing, which on a Sega Genesis is pretty ridiculous. And he shows like basically all the complex behaviors that they had to do to make it work, really messing around with palettes and memory locations and all sorts of fun stuff.
Neat.
I don't really understand it all, but it's really neat.
Yeah, probably had something to do with parallel universes.
Yeah, and blast processing.
If I remember right, the Genesis had a 64 color palette.
Which is not a lot.
So that mustard color outline that we're seeing is probably just the background color or the transparent color.
Okay.
And then you could, because that's the interesting thing about, because with the Sega CD, is that the Sega CD didn't actually add much, if any, processing power to a Sega Genesis. It just added a lot more like space. You could make, because your carts were limited to whatever 4 megabytes or something like that.
Did it add an audio processor?
Yeah, so you could have CD audio,
Right.
So like there's actually RCA outputs on a Sega CD
Yeah.
that you could then have to your stereo, and then it also there was just a lot more space on the cart on the that you could put stuff on, and so how people used it was you could the one thing that you can do with a ton of space but no extra processor power is uncompressed video, just frames, right? Like basically an animated GIF.
Yeah.
with sound. And so that's why, you have like even in Desert Bus, when we reset the game, you see it, we skip through it, but you see there's the thing with like Penn and Teller giving you the introduction to the game.
Yeah.
And stuff like that was a hallmark of Sega CD games.
The what still gets me is that I think about with my DS Lite that Castlevania games came out that had full motion video, like they had animated openings and stuff like that, and they'd always have the thing that's like, oh, the Bink Codec is part of this. I'm like, I don't know. Well, I guess it's because they paid for it, so it's like they're going to use that.
They still do that.
Yeah, and it's weird because at the time I was like, okay, that's what they have to do. But then as the hardware got more and more, got a little bit beefier here and there, so like the 3DS coming out and whatnot, I was under the impression it's like they were getting to a point where it's like, well, maybe we'll move to a different codec or we'll do something different, and then I'm having handheld devices that I know can play back H.264 and whatnot, and yet my 3DS does not do that. It doesn't have the oomph to do it, and that's just still kind of struck me as weird that it's like I'm seeing all this hardware evolution, and yet a lot of game consoles are still kind of, they're in this boat of we're licensing a codec from someplace and that's what we're going to have everybody use. They're going to have to keep using that codec because no matter what, right? It's like because we can't come up with a way to make the hardware decode H.264 or anything along that line.
I remember asking Corey about that at one point, and she was talking about it. I think a lot of it is the actual, like, not so much the efficiency of the codec itself, but the tooling that they've built surrounding it
To make it actually very easy to do that, or
in that it's sort of set up to it integrates a lot very well into the pipeline of the sort of game development stuff.
Okay. Interesting.
Yeah, Bink has been around for ages.
Yeah, and also presumably like the Bink codec that's in a really old game is not the same as I'm assuming that the codec has improved over time as well. They've released new versions
They
of
should
it.
also improve their marketing, because whenever I see something with Bink on it, I'm always kind of like, oh god, this tired old thing that's been around forever, I mean, maybe most people don't care, but from my perspective, it always felt like, oh, this is old technology I'm seeing, which is dumb, I know, but